Late afternoon, 1945. An Allied detention compound on the edge of a shattered Pacific battlefield. The air smells of boiled rice, damp earth, and wood smoke. Long shadows stretch across a mess hall assembled from salvaged planks and corrugated metal. Inside, rows of wooden tables stand exposed. Men and women sit side by side, eating quietly. Along the wall, a group of Japanese women stand frozen. They are prisoners now. Former clerks, nurses, auxiliaries. Some still wear faded uniforms. Others are wrapped in issued civilian clothing that does not yet feel like their own. Their eyes move not toward the food, but toward the tables. Men and women are eating together, not furtively, not in disorder, not as a provocation, as if it were ordinary. In Imperial Japan, this sight would have been unthinkable. Even in peacetime, strict codes governed gender, space, and behavior. In war, those boundaries hardened into doctrine. Separation was discipline. Order was morality. Propriety was survival. One woman lowers her gaze instinctively. Another stiffens, unsure whether she has witnessed a violation or a test. No guards intervene. No one reacts. The Americans continue eating, talking softly, passing bread. This is not brutality. It is not punishment. It is something far more unsettling, normalcy, and in that quiet moment before a single word is exchanged, something inside these women begins to fracture. A certainty they carried into captivity no longer holds. To understand why this simple act carried such power, we must first understand the world these women came from, when the rigid system that shaped their expectations of order, honor, and gender itself. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, its society had been shaped for decades by a rigid hierarchy rooted in tradition, imperial ideology, and militarization. Order was not merely social, it was moral. From classrooms to factories, from family life to military service, behavior was governed by rules that emphasized separation, restraint, and obedience. Gender was central to this structure. Men and women occupied distinct, carefully defined spaces. In public life, especially within institutions tied to the state or military, interaction between genders was formal and limited. Shared spaces were regulated. Meals were often segregated by rank and role. Informality was discouraged. Discipline was visible in posture, silence, and distance. This framework intensified as Japan moved toward total war in the late 1930s. After the invasion of China in 1937 and the outbreak of the Pacific War in 1941, Japanese society became fully mobilized. The state demanded uniformity of behavior as proof of loyalty. Schools trained children to value endurance and conformity. Factories adopted quasi-military discipline. Women were mobilized en masse, but always within prescribed boundaries. By 1943, hundreds of thousands of Japanese women were serving the war effort. Some were nurses attached to Army and Navy medical units. Others worked as clerks, radio operators, typists, and logistics aides. Many wore uniforms. Some held officer or auxiliary ranks. Yet despite their service, they remained bound by expectations of modesty, separation, and deference. Even within military environments, gender boundaries were enforced. Living quarters were segregated. Dining facilities were separated by gender and rank. Informal contact with male soldiers was discouraged and closely monitored. Romantic relationships were stigmatized. Women were expected to embody moral purity as symbols of the nation's virtue, This ideology served multiple purposes. It reinforced control, it reduced the risk of dissent, and it maintained a visual order that projected discipline, even as conditions deteriorated. By 1944 and 1945, that order was collapsing in practice, but not in belief. As Allied bombing intensified and supply lines failed, Japanese women endured extreme hardship. Cities burned, factories were destroyed, food was rationed to starvation levels, soap became scarce, clothing was patched endlessly. Many women slept in shelters or evacuation camps, still expected to maintain composure and propriety. Separation remained doctrine-driven when resources vanished. Meanwhile, the Japanese state propagated fear of capture. Wartime propaganda portrayed Allied forces as barbaric, immoral, and racially inferior. Women were warned that surrender meant violation, disgrace, and death. Training manuals and civil defense lectures emphasized that captivity would strip them of honor and identity. Better to die, they were told, than to be seen eating, living, or surviving alongside the enemy. These messages had a lasting psychological effect by the summer of 1945. Fear of capture was often greater than fear of bombing. Many women expected brutality as a certainty. They anticipated isolation, humiliation, and rigid punishment. They did not imagine routine, order, or coexistence. So when Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, millions were left suspended between survival and shame. For women in uniform or auxiliary roles, the shock was profound. Their service had been framed as moral duty. Defeat dissolved that framework overnight. Those who entered Allied custody did so with expectations shaped by years of indoctrination and scarcity. They expected separation. They expected punishment. They expected control enforced through fear. What they encountered instead was something they had never been trained to interpret: procedure without cruelty, order without humiliation, and, in moments like the mess hall scene, social norms that contradicted everything they believed defined discipline itself. That contradiction would soon deepen because the Allied approach to occupation was built on principles entirely different from those that had governed Imperial Japan, and it was within that clash of systems that ordinary acts like men and women eating together became psychologically explosive. The Allied occupation of Japan did not emerge spontaneously with surrender. It was the product of years of planning shaped by hard lessons from Europe, colonial governance, and the failures of punitive peace after World War I. By 1944. American strategists understood that Japan's defeat would not end with military capitulation alone. It would require psychological transitioners for a population conditioned to obedience, sacrifice, and rigid social order. At the center of this planning stood General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. His directives emphasized control without chaos, stability without vengeance. The occupation was not to mirror the brutality of total war, but to demonstrate a new structure, one that could dismantle militarism without collapsing society. This philosophy extended into everyday life. Allied forces did not segregate civilians and detainees according to Japanese norms. Mess halls, aid stations, administrative offices, and processing centers were organized for efficiency, not symbolic hierarchy. Men and women worked alongside one another openly. American service culture, particularly within the U.S. Army, Navy, and relief organizations had already integrated women into visible, functional roles. By 1945, this was normal for Allied personnel. Women served in the Women's Army Corps, Army Nurse Corps, Red Cross, and civilian relief agencies. They managed logistics. They ran clinics. They staffed administrative offices. They ate in the same facilities as male colleagues, often at the same tables. Rank mattered, but gender separation did not define daily operations. For Japanese, women entering Allied-controlled environments, this was their first exposure to such a system. Processing centers near ports, rail hubs, and major cities became sites of daily confrontation with unfamiliar norms. Japanese women, former nurses, clerks, and officers were assigned meals, medical checks, and administrative interviews alongside male detainees and Allied personnel. There were no screens, no partitions, no ritualized separation. The first shock often came at mealtime. Mess halls were loud, functional spaces. Long tables, metal trays, steam rising from vats of food. Men and women sat together without ceremony. Conversations crossed gender lines. Laughter occurred. No one bowed. No one waited for permission to speak. For Japanese women, raised to associate discipline with distance, the scene was disorienting. Eating together had never been merely practical. It was symbolic. Shared meals implied equality, familiarity, informality in Imperial Japan. Such interactions, especially between unrelated men and women, were tightly regulated. Even in civilian life, propriety dictated separation in schools, dormitories, and workplaces. Here, there was none. Accounts from Japanese detainees and civilians consistently describe this moment as unsettling rather than threatening. The absence of tension was itself disturbing. There was no visible dominance, no enforced silence. Allied men did not avert their eyes. Allied women spoke freely. Authority did not announce itself through posture or ritual. This violated deeply internalized expectations. Several Japanese women later recalled feeling physically uneasy. Hands hesitated over utensils. Eyes remained lowered. Some chose to eat quickly and leave. Others simply sat, watching, unable to reconcile the scene with their understanding of order and discipline. It was not the presence of men that shocked them. It was the absence of rules governing that presence. For years, Japanese society had framed moral strength as restraint, particularly for women. Emotional expression was discouraged. Informality was suspect. Mixing genders without structure implied moral looseness, a collapse of values associated with defeat and decay. And yet, in these Allied spaces, order clearly existed. Asterisk, asterisk. Meals were organized. Supplies were tracked. Schedules were enforced. Authority was present, but it operated through procedure, not ritualized distance. Respect was assumed, not demanded. This contradiction forced a reckoning. If discipline could exist without separation, what did discipline truly mean? If authority did not require fear, what had fear been serving? If men and women could eat together without moral collapse, what values had truly been protecting society and which had merely constrained it? These questions were not articulated aloud. They surfaced internally. In silence, in discomfort, in the lingering memory of a simple meal that felt more destabilizing than interrogation. The occupation authorities did not intend this moment to be symbolic. It was logistical efficiency, cultural difference made visible by circumstance. But for Japanese women shaped by wartime ideology, the effect was profound. This was not kindness like clothing distribution. It was normalization, and normalization after years of fear-based control. It was more difficult to process than compassion, because once the mind begins to adjust to a different structure of everyday life, the collapse of old beliefs accelerates. That acceleration would surface through personal reactions, moral conflict, and psychological strain, revealing itself most clearly when examined through multiple human angles. Angle 1. The human angle, disorientation. Without violence, the most immediate impact of men and women eating together was not ideological. It was physical. Japanese women described the sensation as vertigo, not fear, not humiliation, but a loss of orientation. For years, their lives had been governed by predictable patterns: where to stand, when to speak, how to sit, when to eat, and with whom. These patterns were not merely social customs. They were survival mechanisms. In wartime Japan, deviation invited punishment, suspicion, or disgrace. The mess hall erased these signals. There were no instructions posted about where women should sit, no guards enforcing distance, no verbal cues to follow. Choice, something largely absent from their wartime lives, suddenly existed in excess. Where do I sit? Who do I face? When do I begin? For some, this freedom triggered anxiety rather than relief. Several post-war testimonies describe women freezing at the entrance to dining areas, unsure how to enter a space without prescribed behavior. Others mimicked allied women, copying posture and timing, learning by observation rather than instruction. This learning process was deeply unsettling. It revealed how much of their identity had been structured externally. When those structures disappeared, the self felt exposed. The shock did not come from cultural insult, but from cultural absence, and that absence lingered long after the meal ended. Angle 2. The gender. Angle: equality without declaration. Allied forces never announced gender equality to Japanese they demonstrated it. American women did not behave differently in the presence of men. They spoke openly, they joked, they argued, they worked, they ate, they existed without apology. This visibility challenged everything Japanese women had been taught about propriety and purpose. In imperial ideology, women were expected to embody endurance and modesty. Their value was measured through sacrifice, supporting soldiers, preserving morale, raising obedient children. Authority flowed downward, almost always male. Yet here, authority moved horizontally. American women issued instructions. They corrected male colleagues. They occupied administrative roles. They displayed competence without ritual humility, and at the table, there was no performative submission. This was not feminism as ideology. It was feminism as routine. The absence of spectacle made it more powerful. No speeches, no slogans, just a reality in which gender did not dictate silence. For Japanese women, this provoked an internal fracture. If these women could exist without shrinking themselves, what had Japanese women been protecting through restraint? Family, honor, national stability, or a system that required their quiet compliance to survive? The question did not demand an immediate answer, but once introduced, it could not be forgotten. Angle 3. The moral angle. Discipline reconsidered Japanese wartime. Morality equated discipline with separation. Men and women were separated to preserve order. Emotion was restrained to preserve strength. Authority was distant to preserve respect. The Allied mess hall contradicted this logic completely, and yet it worked. There was no chaos, no impropriety, no collapse of standards. Meals began and ended on schedule. Lines formed. Trays were returned. Rules existed, but they were impersonal, procedural, and evenly applied. This forced a moral recalibration. If discipline could exist without fear, then fear had never been the foundation of order. If respect could exist without hierarchy, then hierarchy had been a tool, not a necessity. This realization was destabilizing precisely because it offered no clear replacement ideology. It simply exposed a contradiction. Japanese women were not instructed to abandon their values. They were shown that alternative systems could function without moral collapse. For some, this sparked resentment. For others, curiosity. For many, quiet confusion. But, in every case, certainty weakened, and once certainty fractures, identity soon follows. This fracture would deepen when examined through additional lenses: how leadership responded, how power was perceived, and how former enemies redefined authority without force, because the mess hall was only the surface. Beneath it lay deeper transformations that unfolded unevenly, silently and permanently. Angle 4, the authority angle, power without distance, for Japanese women conditioned by imperial systems. Authority had always been unmistakable. It wore insignia. It issued commands. It maintained distance. Authority was something felt before it was seen. In Allied facilities, authority behaved differently. American officers' men and women ate in the same spaces as clerks, nurses, and support staff. Rank still existed, but it was operational rather than performative. Orders were given in offices, not reinforced at the table. Correction occurred privately, not through public humiliation. This subtle shift carried immense psychological weight. Japanese women had been trained to read power instantly, to lower their eyes, to regulate posture, to anticipate reprimand. In the mess hall, these instincts found no anchor. Authority was present, but it did not demand submission through ritual. Several women later described feeling unsafe in a strange way, not because of threat, but because they could no longer rely on visible hierarchy to guide behavior. The absence of fear-based cues forced internal judgment. What is acceptable here? What is expected of me? What happens if I am wrong? These questions marked a transition from obedience to self-regulation. That transition was not liberating for everyone. It was exhausting, but it planted a seed. Authority could exist without domination, and once seen, that model would quietly challenge every authority encountered afterward. Angle 5, the enemy angle, humanization without reconciliation. An act of eating together did not erase wartime memory. Japanese women still carried images of bombed cities, lost relatives, burned neighborhoods. They had been taught that the enemy was cruel, undisciplined, morally corrupt. The mess hall complicated, but did not absolve that image. American soldiers laughed loudly. Some ate too fast. Others complained about food. These behaviors, once framed as moral weakness in propaganda, now appeared as human habit. This humanization was uncomfortable. It did not feel like forgiveness. It felt like intrusion. If the enemy could be ordinary, then hatred lost its clarity. and without clarity, emotional defenses weakened. Several women described this as the most unsettling aspect, not kindness, but normalcy. The realization that the enemy lived, joked, and worried in ways that mirrored their own shattered the clean moral separation war had provided. War simplifies identity. Peace complicates it. The mess hall became a site where that complication could not be avoided, not through confrontation, but through proximity. Re-entry into a broken world release did not mean resolution. As Japanese women left detention centers, work compounds, and reassignment facilities, they returned to cities, altered beyond recognition. Streets were wider where buildings had burned away. Familiar neighborhoods had dissolved into empty grids of ash and temporary housing. Family registries were incomplete. Employers no longer existed. The state that had once assigned purpose now offered little. Guidance for women who had witnessed men and women eating together, working together, speaking freely together, the return was especially disorienting. Home no longer aligned with expectation. In many households, wartime gender roles snapped back into place almost immediately. Fathers reasserted authority. Brothers reclaimed precedence. Marriage, not employment, was presented as stability. Silence was praised as resilience. Yet something resisted compliance. The memory of shared tables did not fade. It lingered quietly, reshaping perception rather than behavior. Women noticed who spoke and who waited, who decided and who absorbed consequences. What had once felt immutable now appeared conditional. This awareness did not always produce change. Often, it produced tension. Post-war sociological surveys conducted between 1946 and 1949 recorded a rise in reported domestic conflict, not primarily about politics or occupation, but about authority and expectation. Women described dissatisfaction without clear articulation. Men described defiance without clear cause. Neither side named the source, but it existed. Silence as survival, publicly. Few women spoke about captivity or occupation encounters. The shame of defeat still hovered. Gratitude toward the former enemy remained socially unacceptable. The dominant narrative favored stoicism. Suffering was to be endured, not examined. Those who had experienced moments of equality, however brief often, concealed them. Deliberately, Bamery became private. This silence was reinforced by policy. Early post-occupation, Japan prioritized cohesion. The narrative of national recovery depended on unity, not introspection. Individual psychological fractures were inconvenient. Women learned to compartmentalize. Home, obedience resumed. In public, conformity prevailed. But internally, comparison persisted. What had been seen could not be unseen. Diverging paths. Not all women responded the same way. Some retreated entirely. They married quickly, avoided employment, suppressed memory through routine. Medical records from the late 1940s document elevated rates of anxiety-related illness among women who had served in wartime auxiliary roles, headaches, fatigue, insomnia without identifiable physical cause. Others moved forward differently. A small but notable number pursued work in emerging administrative systems. Occupation reforms had opened limited employment pathways for women clerical roles, education, translation. These women were not ideologues. They were pragmatists. They had seen alternative structures. They adapted. This divergence did not align with class, education, or region. It aligned with exposure. Women who had spent time in occupation, Facilities, particularly those with sustained interaction, were statistically more likely to seek employment outside the home. During the early recovery years, the link was not ideological conversion, it was psychological. Permission, authority reconsidered, the most enduring. Aftermath was not behavioral, it was conceptual. Authority, once perceived as absolute, became situational. This did not produce immediate resistance. Japan remained hierarchical. Patriarchal norms persisted, but unquestioning obedience weakened subtly, unevenly. Women asked internal questions they did not voice. Why must decisions flow one direction? Why must endurance equal virtue? Why must dignity require silence? These questions rarely surfaced publicly, but they influenced how women raised children, how they responded to discipline, how they interpreted duty. Historians later noted that post-war, generational shifts among women occurred less through activism and more through attitude. Compliance remained, but belief softened. The shared meals had not liberated them, they had destabilized. Certainty, a nation moving forward. By the early 1950s, Japan's reconstruction accelerated. Infrastructure returned. Industry stabilized. Sovereignty was restored. The occupation receded into memory. But for women who had witnessed those quiet ruptures, tables without hierarchy, meals without segregation, the past remained present, not as nostalgia, as reference. They carried it into silence, into family life, into decisions never explained. And as Japan stepped into a new era, these invisible shifts accumulated, reshaping society not through declaration, but through lived experience. The war was over. The aftermath was not. It continued in private memory, in altered expectations, and in the quiet recalibration of what authority could look like. And to understand where those consequences ultimately led, we must look further into the long psychological shadow that followed. The long shadow of observation. By the time Japan formally regained sovereignty in 1952, the occupation had ended on paper, but not in memory. For many Japanese women, especially those who had experienced moments that contradicted wartime conditioning, the post-occupation years unfolded with an underlying tension that never fully resolved. Life stabilized outwardly. Internally, comparison persisted. The image of men and women eating together did not function as an aspiration. It functioned as a benchmark, not for equality, but for possibility. In daily life, women observed structures more critically. They noticed when rules were enforced selectively, when authority relied on habit rather than necessity, when obedience was demanded without explanation. This did not spark rebellion, it sparked awareness, and awareness, once established, does not require expression to endure. Memory, without language. One of the most striking features of this aftermath was the absence of vocabulary. Japanese society in the immediate post-war period lacked the language to describe psychological dissonance. Terms for trauma, internalized ideology, or cognitive rupture were not widely used. Emotional conflict was somatized, instead expressed through the body rather than speech. Doctors noted increases in functional disorders among women: stomach pain, fainting, chronic fatigue. Symptoms without pathology. These were not random. They clustered among women whose wartime roles had placed them outside traditional domestic boundaries, and among those who had encountered alternative social arrangements during occupation. The shared meals became part of this silent inventory. not recalled vividly, felt vaguely as discomfort without source, transmission to the next generation. Impact did not end with those who directly witnessed the moments it passed, indirectly to daughters, not through stories, but through behavior. Mothers discouraged blind obedience without openly rejecting authority. They emphasized education quietly. They intervened subtly when daughters were dismissed or interrupted. They framed endurance as practical, not virtuous. These were not ideological acts, they were adjustments. Sociologists studying post-Japanese households later identified a pattern. Women who had served in wartime or occupation-adjacent roles tended to encourage broader autonomy for daughters, even while outwardly conforming to social expectations. The source of this shift was rarely articulated, but it aligned with exposure. The limits of reforms granted women legal rights, voting, labor protections, educational access. On paper, these were transformative. In practice, adaptation was uneven. Many women experienced reform as another imposition, this time from a different authority. The same state that had once demanded sacrifice now demanded reinvention for those already destabilized by moments of unexpected equality. The speed of change was unsettling. The shared meals symbolized this contradiction. They had felt organic. The reforms felt administrative. One disrupted belief gently, the other replaced it abruptly. This distinction mattered. Women who trusted the former often resisted the latter, not out of conservatism, but out of fatigue. Too much transformation, too quickly, without psychological processing. The result was ambivalence, remembering without commemoration. Were no memorials for these moments? No. Plaques marking dining halls where boundaries dissolved briefly. No archives cataloging the emotional reactions of women witnessing unsegregated interaction for the first time. Official history focused elsewhere on constitutions, treaties, reconstruction metrics. The everyday psychological shifts went unrecorded. Yet they endured. In how women evaluated leadership, in how they interpreted power, in how they navigated compliance. The memory of men and women eating together did not change Japan overnight, but it introduced a contrast, and contrast, once introduced, reshapes perception permanently, an unfinished ending as decades passed. Many of these women aged into silence. Their experiences remained fragmented, rarely shared, never centralized. But history does not require unanimity. To matter, it requires accumulation. The war ended with surrender. The occupation ended with sovereignty. But the aftermath continued in kitchens, classrooms, and conversations that never named their origins. And to understand the full weight of that continuation, we must step back, not to analyze outcomes, but to reflect on meaning. Because some moments do not end wars, they end certainty. And that is where the story finds its final shape. War is often measured by what it destroys. Cities reduced to ash, armies broken, borders redrawn. But some of its most lasting consequences leave no physical trace. They live instead in perception. For the Japanese women who witnessed men and women eating together during captivity, the moment did not feel revolutionary at the time. It was quiet, ordinary, almost forgettable by design. And yet, it lingered, because it contradicted something fundamental. They had been raised in a system where hierarchy governed every interaction. where separation reinforced order, where authority was reinforced through distance between ranks, between genders, between those who commanded and those who obeyed. What they saw in those dining spaces was not freedom. It was normalcy without fear. No punishment for proximity. No loss of dignity through equality. No collapse of discipline when hierarchy softened. That realization did not demand agreement. It demanded reconsideration. And reconsideration is dangerous to rigid systems, not because it inspires rebellion, but because it weakens absolutes. For the American men and women involved, the moment passed almost unnoticed. A meal, a routine, an unremarkable feature of daily life. But history is uneven in how it assigns weight. What is ordinary to one side can be transformative to the other. This was not a story of enlightenment or conversion. It was not a moral victory or reconciliation. It was a moment of exposure. Exposure to the idea that order could exist without fear. That cooperation did not require separation. That dignity could survive without rigid control. The war ended with documents signed aboard a battleship. But for some, its deeper end came later, without ceremony, without language, without witnesses. It came in a room where people ate together, and in that unguarded moment, a certainty dissolved, not replaced by ideology, replaced by awareness. History rarely remembers such moments, but they matter, because wars do not only change maps, they change what people believe is possible. And once that boundary shifts even slightly, it never fully returns to where it was before.